I've never told anyone this story before. Not my friends, not my family, not even the therapist I saw for 3 months after it happened, but I can't keep it inside anymore. What I experienced in those woods 2 years ago changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand, and maybe, just maybe, someone out there has had something similar happen to them. Maybe I'm not going crazy after all. My name is Jake, and I was 23 when this happened. I'd always been an outdoors guy, hiking, camping, you name it. I grew up in Oregon, so the wilderness was basically my backyard. I thought I knew forests. I thought I understood how they worked, how they sounded, how they felt. I was wrong about everything. It was late September when I decided to take a solo camping trip to the Cascades National Forest. I'd been working 60-hour weeks at a tech startup, and I was burned out. My girlfriend Sarah had just broken up with me, saying I was emotionally unavailable, whatever that meant. I figured a few days alone in the woods would clear my head, help me figure out what I wanted to do with my life. I chose a trail I'd never been on before, something called the Whispering Creek Trail. The name should have been my first warning, but at the time, I thought it sounded peaceful. The trailhead was about 4 hours from Portland, tucked away in a section of forest that didn't see much traffic. Perfect for someone who wanted to be alone with their thoughts. The hike in was beautiful. Old growth, Douglas firs stretched up like cathedral pillars, and the afternoon light filtered through the canopy in those magical golden beams that make you believe in something bigger than yourself. I felt my stress melting away with each step. The trail was well maintained for the first few miles, then gradually became more overgrown, more primitive. I liked that it felt like I was leaving civilization behind. I'd planned to hike about 8 miles to a clearing marked on my map, set up camp, and spend 3 days just decompressing. The clearing was supposed to be near Whispering Creek, which would give me fresh water and the soothing sound of running water to fall asleep to. It sounded perfect, but when I reached the spot where the clearing should have been, according to my GPS, there was nothing but dense forest. No creek, no open space, just trees. I double-checked my coordinates, thinking maybe I'd made an error, but everything looked right. It was getting late, probably around 5 p.m., and I could see the lights starting to fade through the canopy. That's when I heard it for the first time. A sound like wind moving through the trees, but there was no wind. The air was completely still, almost unnaturally so. But somewhere in the distance, I could hear this soft whooshing, like breath being drawn in and released. It was rhythmic, almost like breathing. I stood there listening for maybe 5 minutes, trying to figure out what could make that sound. Maybe it was the creek I was looking for, just further away than expected. Sound carries strangely in the forest sometimes. I decided to follow the noise, thinking it would lead me to water and maybe that elusive clearing. The sound led me off the trail, deeper into the woods. I should have trusted my instincts and turned back, but I was tired and starting to worry about losing daylight completely. The whooshing got louder as I walked, and I noticed something else. The forest was getting quieter around me. No bird calls, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, no insects buzzing. Just that rhythmic whooshing ahead of me and the sound of my own footsteps on the forest floor. After about 20 minutes of bushwhacking through increasingly thick undergrowth, I finally found a clearing. But it wasn't the nice, open meadow I'd been expecting. This was a perfect circle of bare earth, maybe 30 feet across, surrounded by a ring of massive old trees. The ground inside the circle was completely barren. No grass, no fallen leaves, no undergrowth, just dark, packed earth that looked almost polished. The breathing sound was loudest here, seeming to come from everywhere at once, but I still couldn't see any source for it. No creek, no wind moving through the trees. The air was so still, it felt heavy, oppressive. I should have left then. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get out of there, to find the trail and hike back to my car, even if it meant hiking in the dark. But exhaustion and stubbornness won out. I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was just a clearing, just some acoustic trick of the landscape making strange sounds. I'd set up camp, get a good night's sleep, and everything would make sense. In the morning, I pitched my tent on the edge of the circle, right at the tree line. I didn't want to camp in the center of that bare patch. Something about it felt wrong, though I couldn't explain why. The breathing sound continued as I worked, steady and rhythmic. And I found myself starting to time my movements to it without realizing it. As darkness fell, the sound seemed to get louder. Or maybe it was just that without the distractions of daylight, I was noticing it more. I sat outside my tent, eating a cold dinner, and trying to convince myself that this was normal. That I was just overthinking things because I was stressed and alone. That's when I noticed the trees on the dying light. I could just make out the massive trunks that ringed the clearing. They were old, really old. Their bark was almost black, and they were enormous, easily 6 feet across at the base. But what struck me as odd was how they were positioned. They formed a perfect circle around the clearing, evenly spaced, like they'd been planted that way. But trees don't grow in perfect geometric patterns naturally. As full darkness settled over the forest, the breathing sound changed. It got deeper, more pronounced, and I started to hear something else underneath it, a kind of ... whispering. Not words exactly, but sounds that almost seemed like they could be words, if I just listened hard enough. I retreated into my tent and zipped it shut, telling myself I was just tired and my imagination was running away with me. The forest at night always sounds different than during the day. Every experienced camper knows that. But as I lay there in my sleeping bag, listening to that rhythmic breathing and the almost whispers underneath it, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. And that's when I realized something that made my blood run cold. In all my years of camping, I'd never been in a forest this quiet. There should have been night sounds, owls calling, small animals moving through the underbrush, insects chirping, but there was nothing. Just the breathing and the whispers, and underneath it all, a silence so complete, it felt like being wrapped in cotton. I lay awake for hours, listening, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I fell into a fitful sleep, the sound of that rhythmic breathing following me into my dreams. I woke up at 3:17 a.m. I know the exact time because I checked my watch immediately. That digital glow, the only light in the absolute darkness of my tent. But I wasn't woken by my alarm, or by the need to use the bathroom, or by any normal camping discomfort. I was woken by the silence. The breathing had stopped. You know how sometimes you don't realize a sound is there until it's gone? That's what this was like, but amplified 100 times. The absence of that rhythmic whooshing felt like a physical weight pressing down on me. I lay there in my sleeping bag, straining to hear anything, the whispers, the breathing even, just the normal sounds of a forest at night. But there was nothing. The silence was so complete it felt hostile. I unzipped my sleeping bag as quietly as I could and crawled to the front of my tent. My hands were shaking from cold. I told myself, though the September night wasn't particularly chilly, I slowly unzipped the tent flap just enough to peek out. The clearing looked different in the darkness. The bare earth seemed to have a faint luminescence to it, like it was reflecting light that wasn't there. And the trees, God, the trees. In daylight, they'd just looked old and oddly positioned, but now, in the darkness, they looked like they were leaning inward. Their massive trunks tilted at angles that defied what I remembered from setting up camp. I blinked hard, telling myself it was just my eyes playing tricks in the dark. Trees. Don't move. But when I looked again, I could swear they were closer to the clearing than they'd been before. The circle of bare earth seemed smaller. That's when I saw the footprints. Leading from the tree line, crossing the bare earth in a perfect spiral pattern, were tracks. Not animal tracks. I'd grown up hunting with my dad, and I knew animal prints. These were human footprints, bare feet, but wrong somehow. Too long, too narrow, with what looked like claw marks extending from where the toes should be. The spiral pattern led from the edge of the clearing inward, getting tighter and tighter until it reached the exact center, where it simply ... stopped. Like whatever had made those tracks had just vanished into thin air. I stared at those prints for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. They definitely hadn't been there when I'd set up camp. The earth had been smooth, unmarked, and I would have noticed something that obvious, that deliberate. The spiral was too perfect, too intentional, to be natural. My rational mind was working overtime, trying to find explanations. Maybe another camper had been here earlier, and I'd missed the tracks in the fading light. Maybe it was some kind of animal I wasn't familiar with. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. Whatever had made those tracks, it hadn't been there. During daylight hours, I was about to zip my tent back up, when I heard it, a sound that made every hair on my body stand up. It was coming from directly above me, from the canopy of the massive tree I'd pitched my tent beside. A soft scratching sound like fingernails on bark, but rhythmic, deliberate. I tilted my head back, trying to see up into the branches, but the darkness was absolute. The scratching continued, moving slowly around the trunk of the tree, circling my tent. Whatever was making that sound was big. I could hear the branches creaking under its weight. Then it stopped directly overhead. I held my breath, not daring to move. The silence stretched out, broken only by the thundering of my own heartbeat. Then, so quietly, I almost missed it. I heard a sound that made my blood freeze. Humming. Someone or something was humming. A tune I didn't recognize. It was a woman's voice, soft and melodic, but there was something off about it. The melody was beautiful, haunting, but it seemed to bend and twist in ways that human voices shouldn't be able to manage. Notes that were too high, too low, too long. The humming continued for maybe 10 minutes. That eerie melody drifting down from the branches above my tent. I wanted to look up, to see what was making that sound, but I couldn't bring myself to move. Some primitive part of my brain was screaming at me to stay perfectly still, to not draw attention to myself. Finally, the humming faded away, and I heard the sound of something moving through the branches, away from my tent and toward the center of the clearing. The tree branches stopped creaking, but I could still sense movement above me, around me. That's when the whispering started again. But this time, it wasn't coming from the clearing. It was coming from the trees themselves. All around the circle, from every massive trunk, I could hear soft voices. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all whispering in unison. I couldn't make out words, but the rhythm was hypnotic. Almost like a chant. I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to block out the sound, but it didn't help. The whispers seemed to come from inside my head as much as from the trees, and underneath the whispering, I could hear something else, a sound like rustling leaves. Even though the air was still and most of the trees were evergreens, the rustling got louder, and I realized it wasn't leaves at all. It was the sound of movement, of many things moving through the branches above me. The entire canopy seemed to be alive with activity, but I couldn't see anything in the darkness. I grabbed my flashlight with shaking hands and pointed it upward, but the beam seemed to be swallowed by the darkness. It illuminated maybe 6 feet above me before fading into nothing, as if the darkness itself was solid, impenetrable. That's when I made my first real mistake. I should have stayed in my tent, waited for daylight, and gotten out of there as fast as possible. But fear and curiosity got the better of me. I had to know what was happening. I unzipped my tent fully and stepped outside. The moment my feet touched the ground, everything stopped. The whispering cut off mid-syllable. The rustling ceased. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. The sudden silence was more terrifying than all the sounds had been. I stood there in the absolute darkness, my flashlight beam still being swallowed after just a few feet, and I could feel eyes on me. Hundreds of eyes, watching from the trees, from the shadows, from places I couldn't see or imagine. The weight of that attention was almost physical. I took a step toward the center of the clearing, toward that spiral of footprints, and immediately regretted it. The bare earth under my feet felt wrong, too soft, too warm, like it was alive. But I kept walking, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't explain. As I got closer to the center of the spiral, my flashlight beam started to work better. The darkness seemed to thin out, and I could see more of the clearing. That's when I noticed that the footprints weren't just on the surface of the earth. They were impressed deep into the ground, as if whatever had made them was impossibly heavy. Reached the center of the spiral and stopped. The exact spot where the footprints ended was marked by a small depression in the earth, perfectly circular, about the size of a manhole cover. The depression was filled with what looked like black water, but when I shined my flashlight on it, the surface didn't reflect the light. It absorbed it, like looking into a hole in the world. I knelt down beside the depression, and that's when I heard it, a voice, clear as day, coming from the black water. Jake, my own name, spoken in that same beautiful, impossible voice that had been humming from the trees. I jerked backward, stumbling, my flashlight beam swinging wildly around the clearing. Jake, the voice came again, but this time it was coming from everywhere at once. From the trees, from the ground beneath my feet, from the air around me. I ran. I didn't think, didn't plan, didn't even grab my gear. I just ran blindly into the forest, crashing through undergrowth, branches tearing at my clothes and skin. Behind me, I could hear laughter, that same impossible voice, but now laughing. A sound like wind chimes made of glass and starlight. I ran until I couldn't run anymore, until my lungs burned and my legs gave out. I collapsed against a tree, gasping, and only then did I realize that I was completely lost. I had no idea which direction I'd run, no idea how to get back to the clearing, no idea how to find the trail. But the worst part was the silence. The forest around me was dead quiet, just like the clearing had been. No night sounds, no insects, no wind. Just me, breathing hard in the darkness, and the growing certainty that I was not alone. That's when I heard my name again, whispered from the darkness ahead of me. Jake. The voice calling my name wasn't coming from one direction. It was everywhere, bouncing between the trees like an echo that refused to die. But here's the thing that still haunts me. It wasn't just one voice anymore. It was dozens of voices, all saying Jake in perfect unison. Like a choir of whispers in the darkness, I pressed my back against the tree trunk, trying to make myself as small as possible. My flashlight was dying, the beam getting weaker by the minute, and I knew that, once it went out completely, I'd be trapped in absolute darkness with whatever was out there. That's when I started to understand what was really happening. This wasn't random. The clearing, the footprints, the voices, they'd been waiting for me specifically. Somehow, this place knew who I was before I'd even arrived. I thought about the trail name, Whispering Creek Trail. Had there ever been a creek at all? Or was the whispering something else entirely? I remembered now that when I'd researched the trail online, there hadn't been many reviews. Just a few scattered comments about it being peaceful and life-changing. At the time, I'd thought that sounded perfect. Now those words felt ominous. The voices were getting closer, and with them came footsteps. Not the heavy, deliberate steps of the spiral pattern, but light, almost dancing steps, like children playing in the forest. But I knew they weren't children. Children don't move through dense undergrowth without making noise, don't navigate perfectly in pitch darkness. I forced myself to move, to keep walking deeper into the forest. Maybe I could find the trail, or at least get far enough away from whatever was hunting me to wait for daylight. But with each step, the forest seemed to change around me. Trees that had been on my left were suddenly on my right. Paths that seemed to lead one way would curve back on themselves. It was like the woods were rearranging themselves to keep me lost. My flashlight finally died about an hour before dawn. The moment the beam flickered out for the last time, the voices stopped calling my name. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the whispers had been. I stood there in the absolute darkness, waiting for my eyes to adjust, but they never did. The darkness was too complete, too thick. That's when I felt the first touch. Just a brush against my shoulder, so light, I almost missed it. Then another touch on my arm, and another on my back. Gentle, almost affectionate, like someone stroking a pet. But there was no one there. I swung my arms wildly, trying to hit whatever was touching me, but I hit nothing but air. The touches multiplied, dozens of invisible hands, all over my body, in my hair, on my face. Not grabbing or hurting, just exploring. Like they were trying to figure out what I was put together. I screamed and ran again, but the touches followed me, staying with me no matter how fast I moved. I don't know how long I ran. Through that impossible forest, time seemed to move differently there, stretching and compressing like the space around me. Sometimes I felt like I'd been running for hours, other times like only minutes had passed. But eventually, I saw light ahead, not the warm light of sunrise, but a cold blue glow filtering through the trees. I stumbled toward it and found myself back at the clearing, but it wasn't the same clearing I'd fled from. This one was larger, and the circle of bare earth was filled with dozens of those spiral footprint patterns, overlapping and intersecting in complex geometric designs. The black pool at the center had grown too, now the size of a small pond, and its surface rippled with movement, even though there was no wind. And standing around the edge of the clearing, just at the tree line, were figures. I couldn't see them. Clearly they seemed to shift and blur whenever I tried to focus on them, like heat mirages, but they were human-shaped, tall and thin, and they were all facing me, waiting for me. One of them stepped forward, and as it moved into the blue light, I could see it more clearly. It looked like a woman, but wrong in every possible way. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent at angles that made my eyes water to look at. Her face was beautiful and terrible at the same time, perfect features that didn't quite fit together properly. Like a photograph that had been cut up and reassembled by someone who didn't understand human anatomy. When she spoke, it was with that same impossible voice I'd been hearing all night. "You've been looking for us your whole life, Jake. In every forest you've entered, every trail you've walked. You just didn't know it yet." She was right, and that's what terrified me most. I had been drawn to the wilderness my entire life, always searching for something I couldn't name. Every camping trip, every hike, I'd felt like I was looking for something just out of reach. And now, I'd found it. "We've been calling people like you for centuries," she continued, her voice echoing from every direction at once. "People who hear the whispers in the wind, who feel the pull of the deep woods. Most ignore the call, but you answered." The other figures began to move, forming a circle around me. As they moved, I could see that they weren't quite touching the ground. They glided just above the surface, their feet never quite making contact with the earth. "What do you want?" I managed to ask, though my voice came out as barely a whisper. She smiled, and her smile had too many teeth, all of them perfectly white and sharp. "We want you to stay, Jake. We want you to become like us. To help us call others who can hear the whispers." As she spoke, I felt something changing inside me. The fear was still there, but underneath it was something else, a sense of belonging, of coming home. The forest around me didn't feel alien anymore. It felt familiar, welcoming. I could understand now why it had been so quiet, so empty of normal forest sounds. This place existed between worlds, in the spaces where reality grew. Thin, I took a step toward her, then another. The bare earth felt warm under my feet, almost alive. The other figures watched me approach, and I could hear them humming that same haunting melody I'd heard earlier. It was beautiful, hypnotic, and I found myself humming along. But then, just as I reached the edge of the black pool, the sun crested the mountains. The moment the first rays of natural sunlight touched the clearing, everything changed. The figures flickered like candle flames in a wind, their forms becoming translucent. The woman who had been speaking to me let out a sound that was part scream, part sigh, and then she was gone. They all were. The clearing was empty, except for me, standing at the edge of what was now just a small depression in the earth, filled with murky rainwater. The spiral footprints were gone. The blue light was gone. Even the massive trees that had ringed the clearing were normal-sized now, scattered randomly through the forest instead of forming that perfect circle. But the silence remained. Even in full daylight, the forest was unnaturally quiet. I found the trail about a quarter mile away and hiked out in a daze. My gear was still back at the campsite, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get back to my car, back to civilization, back to a world that made sense. It took me 3 hours to reach the trailhead, and when I got there was a park ranger waiting by my car. "You, Jake Morrison?" he asked when he saw me emerge from the trees. I nodded, too exhausted to speak. "Got a call about you yesterday evening. Someone reported seeing your car here, but no sign of you on the trail. We were about to organize a search party yesterday evening, but I'd only been in the woods for one night. I checked my phone, it was dead, but my watch was still working. According to it, I'd been in the forest for 3 days." The ranger looked at me with concern. "You okay, son? You look like you've seen a ghost." I almost laughed at that. A ghost would have been easier to explain, easier to dismiss. What I'd seen was something much older, much stranger. Something that existed in the spaces between our understanding of the world. I told the ranger I'd gotten lost, that I was fine, just tired. He offered to escort me to a hospital, but I declined. I just wanted to go home. That was 2 years ago. I've tried to go camping since then, but I can't. Every forest feels wrong now, like it's waiting for something. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind is blowing through the trees outside my apartment, I hear it, that same haunting melody calling to me. I've done research since then. The Whispering Creek Trail doesn't exist on any official map. The Forest Service has no record of it. But if you dig deep enough into local folklore, into old newspaper archives and pioneer journals, you'll find stories. People who went into the woods and came back changed. People who went into the woods and never came back at all. I know I should consider myself lucky. I got out, but sometimes, in the quiet moments between sleep and waking, I wonder if I really did escape. Or if part of me is still standing at the edge of that black pool, listening to voices that call my name in the darkness. Because here's the thing I haven't told you yet, the thing that keeps me awake at night. When I looked in the mirror after I got home, I noticed something different about my reflection. My eyes were the same color, my face was the same shape, everything looked normal. But sometimes, when the light hits just right, I can see myself standing in a forest clearing, surrounded by figures that shimmer and shift in the darkness. And in that reflection, I'm smiling with too many teeth, and my feet don't quite touch the ground. The calls are getting stronger now. I don't know how much longer I can resist them. And if you're hearing this story, if something about it feels familiar, if you've ever felt that pull toward the deep woods, maybe that's not an accident. Maybe you're supposed to find me.